The Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee will come to order. The title of today's subcommittee hearing is A Global Perspective on Cyber Threats. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. The chair now recognizes himself for 3 minutes for an opening statement. The purpose of today's hearing is to identify the United States' primary cyber enemies, better understand the growing global cyber threat, and ultimately formulate more effective responses to cyber incidents. The cyber landscape today is vastly different from that of past years, with technology an integral component of nearly all transactions, means of communication, and methods of transportation. In recent years, there has been a growing focus on protecting the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. However, in the wake of the breach of over 4 million personnel records at the Office of Personnel Management, it is still clear that much more needs to be done to protect Americans from cyber threats. Cybercrime provides a clear and present danger to the United States of America. At the other end of these attacks are nation states like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, terrorist groups, criminal organizations, and hacktivists. These groups can range from sophisticated cyber actors to ideological groups motivated by political or patriotic reasons. While their motivations may vary, there remains one constant: they intend to hurt America and our interests. Not only are they targeting the critical infrastructure of our country, like banks, power grids, food supplies, but they also pose a much graver threat directly to the citizens of the United States. Nearly every government agency has been a target of cyber attacks. And with the recent OPM breach, the federal government has now provided a channel for these criminals to access sensitive personal information. In the wake of these incidents, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, continues to collect information on consumers and their financial practices. And Obamacare has created a vast data hub to collect and store scores of highly sensitive personal and health information on American citizens. This most recent cyber attack on OPM should underscore the urgency around reconsidering the need for such governmental data collection programs. The benefits do not outweigh the privacy risks to American citizens. The extent to which this information is utilized to harm our government's employees is yet to be known. But what is known is that more needs to be done to mitigate these cyber risks. I welcome our distinguished panel this morning and look forward to hearing more about what the federal government can do and should be doing to protect our country and our citizens from these cyber criminals. With that, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses as well. Mr. Chairman, there appears to be clear and convincing evidence that cyber attacks pose a clear and present danger, not only to United States businesses, but also to the U.S. government itself. The preponderance of the evidence shows that 2014 was a banner year for cyber criminals. According to a report from the Heritage Foundation, written by Riley Walters, the list of cyber attacks in 2014 on private U.S. companies include the following excerpts. And Mr. Chairman, in my opinion, one of the best ways to appreciate the magnitude of a problem is to examine and review some of the components. Let's review some of the components. January 2014, Target hacked, 70 million people impacted. Neiman Marcus hacked, impact, 350,000 persons. Michael's retail store hacked, impact, 2.6 million customers. Yahoo hacked, impact, 273 million users. April 2014, Aaron Brothers retail store hacked, impact, 400,000 customers. May 2014, eBay hacked, 233 million customers. June 2014, Feely Communications hacked, impact, 15 million users. In September 2014, Home Depot, 56 million shoppers impacted by a hack. Google, 5 million. Goodwill Industries, $868,000. And of course, in October, J.P. Morgan Chase impact 76 million households. According to this report, in 2014, the annual average cost per company of successful cyber attacks increased to $20.8 million in the financial services industry, $14.5 million in the technology sector, and $12.7 million in the communications industry. These are real people, these are real concerns, and they must be addressed. Mr. Chairman, I fear that FBI Director James Comey was right when he proclaimed there are two kinds of big companies in the United States: those who have been hacked and those who don't know that they've been hacked. Mr. Chairman, I will yield back the balance of my time. Rather than yield back, I will share it with the gentlelady that you will call next.
Thank you, Mr. Green. The chair now recognizes for 1 minute the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, the vice chair of our committee, for 1 minute.
Thank the chairman and also the three witnesses here today to share your experience and your knowledge with the committee. The protection of our personal data is increasingly a critical part of our private lives, and the threat of data breaches from state or non-state actors looms heavy over security experts in nearly every sector of the American economy. These types of attacks have real financial and emotional consequences. When families back in my hometown of Levittown learned that their information was compromised, they'd immediately become concerned will they be able to use their debit card to purchase gas and groceries. But for our nation's financial institutions, the risks are significant and they are systemic. As chairman of the task force to investigate terror finance, I'm especially interested in the possibility that this data, once stolen, could be sold to fund illicit operations, or as recent reports regarding the OPM theft have shown, be used against United States government personnel. I look forward to hearing the witnesses' testimony and hope that this committee can work together to strengthen and protect this vital part of our nation's security and infrastructure. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Arizona for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duffy and Ranking Member Green. Earlier this month, the Office of Personnel Management revealed that at least 4 million, and perhaps substantially more, current and former federal employees from nearly every federal agency, some of them military and defense personnel living in Arizona, may have had their personal information stolen. While DHS and the FBI continue to investigate this incident, it is strongly suspected that Chinese hackers are responsible for the breach. Cyber attacks from state and non-state actors have increased dramatically in recent years. The U.S. government needs a clear strategy to deter as well as detect and defeat ever-changing cyber threats. Federal law sets forth various requirements, roles, and responsibilities for securing federal agencies' systems and information. Despite these measures, according to an April 2015 GAO report, federal agencies continue to demonstrate shortcomings in assessing risks, developing and implementing security controls, and monitoring results. Securing our government requires strengthened security controls and information sharing infrastructures. Educating federal employees and contractors is also crucial if these efforts are to be successful. I look forward to hearing more from our witnesses today about the effectiveness of actions taken by federal agencies to address cyber vulnerabilities. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. We now recognize our witnesses. We have Mr. Frank Salufo, an Associate Vice President at George Washington University, Director of the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, and Co-Director of GW's Cyber Center for National and Economic Security. Mr. Salufo has published extensively on cyber and homeland security. In addition, he has served on various national security-related committees sponsored by the government and nonprofits, including as the Vice Chairman of the Future of Terrorism Task Force of the Homeland Security Advisory Council and Chairman of the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review Advisory Council. Previously, Mr. Salufo served as Special Assistant to the President for Homeland Security. Immediately after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, President George W. Bush appointed him to the Office of Homeland Security, where he was a principal advisor to Governor Tom Ridge. Mr. Salufo directed the President's Homeland Security Advisory Council. We also have Mr. Michael Madden, He serves on the Board of Advisors of the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and is the Vice President for Business Development at Red Owl Analytics. Previously, Mr. Madden served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis of the Treasury Department, where he developed strategies to help identify and mitigate cyber risks within both the department and the financial sector. Mr. Madden holds an MBA from Wharton School, a Master's of International Affairs from Columbia, and a BA from Cornell. He is a recipient of the Bronze Star, the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, and Treasury's Distinguished Service Award. And finally, but not least, Mr. Balak. Welcome. He is the Chief Security Strategist at FireEye, a non-resident senior fellow in the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, and a board member for the Open Information Security Foundation. Mr. Balak was Mandiant's Chief Security Officer. Before that, he was the Director of Incident Response for GE, and before that, worked extensively in the private sector. Previously, Mr. Balak was a military intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force, Computer Emergency Response Team, Air Force Information Warfare Center, and Air Intelligence Agency. He holds a Master of Public Policy from Harvard University and a BS from the United States Air Force Academy. So with that, gentlemen, you will each be recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, the witnesses' testimony will be made part of the record following their oral remarks. Once the witnesses have finished presenting their testimony, each member of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes within which to ask questions. Now, on your table, you have 3 lights: green, yellow, and red. Yellow means you have 1 minute left. Red means your time is up. The microphones are sensitive, so please make sure that you're speaking directly into them. And with that, Mr. Sulu, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Green and the distinguished members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify before you today. I thought red meant we were being hacked, given the topic, but glad that I've got to sum up my remarks quickly. I thought all of you did a terrific job summing up the threat, so I'll try to zero in on a handful of different issues that hopefully we'll have time to explore further during Q&A. Clearly, the U.S. currently faces a dizzying array of cyber threats from many and varied actors. Virtually every day there is a new incident in the headlines, and the initiative today clearly remains with the attacker. The U.S. financial services sector, from banks to credit card companies to exchanges and clearinghouses, is clearly in the crosshairs and are primary targets for cyber attacks and cyber crime. To give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, consider the following figures which were provided to me by a major U.S. bank on a non-for-attribution basis. Just last week, they faced 30,000 cyber attacks. This amounts to an attack every 34 seconds, each and every day. And these are just the attacks that the bank actually knows about, by virtue of a known malicious signature or IP address. As for the source of the attacks, approximately 22,000 came from criminal organizations and 400 from nation-states. A few words on the threat itself. Firstly, not all hacks are the same, nor are all hackers the same. The threat comes in various shapes, sizes, and forms, ranging from nation-states at the high end of the threat spectrum to foreign terrorist organizations, criminal enterprises, and hacktivists. Just as diverse as the threat actors themselves are their intentions, capabilities, and TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, and the tools they utilize to commit these crimes. Put another way, nearly every form of conflict today and tomorrow will have a cyber dimension to it. Whereas technologies will continue to evolve and change, human nature remains consistent. If it happens in the physical world, it's happening in the cyber world. And increasingly you're seeing the physical and cyber worlds converge. One factor that makes cyber unique, of course, is time and space, or speed and impact. You can commit a cybercrime without ever stepping foot in the target area or even the same country, and it would take years, say, to rob bank after bank after bank, which can now be done in a matter of nanoseconds, pointing and clicking on a mouse. A couple very quick top-line words on the threat actors. As I mentioned earlier, nation-states and their proxies continue to present the greatest, meaning most advanced and persistent threat in the cyber domain. Topping the list are countries that are integrating computer network attack and computer network exploit into their warfighting doctrine and strategy. The most sophisticated and active countries are China and Russia. It is also worth noting that the two countries recently signed a major cybersecurity agreement, dubbed by a friend of mine as a new axis of evil. Both China and Russia are known to use proxies to do their bidding, to provide plausible deniability of their attacks if they get caught. After these two countries come Iran and North Korea. While perhaps not up to par with Russia or China in terms of capability, both countries are investing very heavily into building out their cyber capacity, and what they may lack in capability, they more than make up for in intent. Moreover, they are more likely to turn to computer network attack rather than merely espionage, demonstrated by Iran's distributed denial of service attacks on U.S. banks and North Korea's recent attack on Sony. Next up are foreign terrorist organizations. They certainly possess the motivation and intent, but fortunately they have yet to fully develop a sustained cyber attack capability. The recent doxing attacks, however, on our U.S. military and law enforcement personnel is a very troubling sign that they're coming up with new tactics, and I think it's indicative of an emerging threat. It is likely that ISIS or their sympathizers will increasingly turn to disruptive cyber attacks. By contrast, criminal organizations possess substantial capabilities, but their motivation and intent obviously differs from foreign terrorist organizations. Rather than being motivated by ideology, they're motivated by profit. And they're continuing, one of the trends we're seeing is working as proxies with other nation states, as I mentioned, vis-a-vis Russia. And then, of course, you've got hacktivists, and regardless of the cause, they're going to use their techniques for special interests, and some of those could be very sophisticated, and their intent is normally to embarrass, to bring attention to their cause. While I had planned to say a couple words on what we should do about all this, I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss that during Q&A. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salufo. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Madden for 5 minutes.
Chairman Duffy, Vice Chairman Fitzpatrick, Ranking Member Green, and other distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor to appear before you to discuss the global cyber threats we face and, in my view, more importantly, what we can do about it. During my time at Treasury, I was fortunate to work for and with a team of true innovators, developing novel strategies and approaches to identify and mitigate the cyber risks and vulnerabilities facing both the department and the financial sector more broadly. The thoughts I'm sharing today are inspired by that early Treasury work and the thinking spearheaded by Juan Zarate and his Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. If the recent attacks against J.P. Morgan and Citibank serve as examples, banks are prime targets for sophisticated organized cyber attacks, despite a dramatic increase in cybersecurity spend. In my view, the rise in frequency and breadth of cyber attacks can be attributed to 5 primary threats: nation-states, cyber terrorists, hacktivists, organized criminal elements, and malicious, compromised, or negligent employees, in other words, the insider threat. So why banks? On a tactical level, banks hold not just money, but also collect and centralize sensitive, personally identifiable information and clients' intellectual property. But our cyber threats see a greater purpose in hitting banks. They serve as both key systemic actors important for the functioning of the global economy and as chief protagonists in the isolation of bad actors from the financial system. It is clear from watching these attacks dramatically increase in both frequency and damage, our nation's current defensive posture is simply not sufficient to address the threat. We need to have a more proactive approach, one that shifts the paradigm away from defense to offense. We can take inspiration from the anti-money laundering and sanctions model forged at Treasury and leverage financial pressure against cyber threats to better protect the financial system. This economic and cybersecurity approach requires a new paradigm of U.S. public-private engagement and collaboration. Adopting language from Treasury's successful campaign, cyber-driven, targeted financial measures is, at its core, a thoughtful set of decisions that change our cyber posture from a defensive crouch to an offensive charge. These measures can encourage the creation of an internal financial intelligence units to enhance financial sector and augment U.S. intelligence community collection and analysis efforts. Enhance the safe harbor regime to encourage greater information sharing among financial institutions. Enhance Section 314B of the U.S. Patriot Act to allow financial institutions to share information about suspect cyber-related financial activity within their sector without liability. Accelerate the U.S. government's targeting of state actors, networks, and individuals that attack U.S. private sector systems, especially financial systems. Deploy the President's emergency economic powers for the use of multiple tools to address the reality of major cyber espionage, crime, and infiltration affecting the U.S. financial and commercial system. And encourage Congress to craft legislation to empower the Secretary of the Treasury to identify jurisdictions, institutions, or networks that are sponsoring or willfully allowing their territory or systems to be used to attack American financial institutions as a precursor to sanctions. Innovative attacks require innovative responses, and Congress could enlist the private sector in participating in cyber-driven, targeted, active defensive measures that reward, enable, and empower the private sector to help defend itself in concert with the government. Yes, this would require rule setting, more active collaboration, and explicit line drawing and processes, but such a regime is imaginable. This model could be based on the tradition of congressional issuances of letters of marque and reprisal, as provided for explicitly in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. This model could take different forms to include a reward program for those groups able to uncover, identify, and even deliver cyber hackers to U.S. courts or authorities, unleashing cyber forensic teams and private litigants and plaintiffs' lawyers against those attacking U.S. systems, empowering victims of attacks to sue the perpetrators and those benefiting directly from any cyber infiltrations, just as victims of terrorism are provided the right to sue terrorists and their supporters today, and encouraging Justice, DHS, and Treasury to consider issuing special cyber warrants to allow private sector actors to track and even disrupt cyber attacks in certain instances to defend their systems. Committee members, thank you for allowing me to appear before you and discuss global cyber threats. My colleagues at the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance and I look forward to collaboratively devising and implementing strategies to defeat the growing cyber threats that confront our nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Madden. Mr. Balak, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Green, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My employer, FireEye, provides software to stop digital intruders with 3,400 customers in 67 countries, including half of the Fortune 500. In 2014, our Mandiant Consulting Service conducted hundreds of investigations in 13 countries. So my testimony today is based on not only my experience doing my own work, but also on the experience of our company doing these investigations. The title of this hearing includes the phrase cyber threat, and it's important to understand the threat, but we also need to expand that to include the concept of risk. We need to think in terms of threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. Risk is a function of these three factors, and if we influence any one, our overall level of security will change as well. Furthermore, while risk is a forward-looking concept where we worry about what could happen, some scenarios have already occurred, making that theoretical risk an actualized event. I separate damaging scenarios into two buckets, chronic and acute. Chronic scenarios occur over an extended period with impacts spread across time in ways that can be difficult to measure. Acute scenarios, on the other hand, involve immediate and distinct impact, usually with obvious physical or virtual damage. Thankfully, we've not yet seen a combination of those two, meaning long-term, highly visible, costly damage, and hopefully that will remain the case. The U.S. is currently suffering three important chronic damage scenarios. First, foreign nation-state actors are stealing sensitive data and commercial secrets from private organizations for use by their domestic industries. Second, these actors are stealing sensitive and classified data on American military and intelligence plans and technologies to benefit their strategic interests. Third, foreign actors are stealing personally identifiable information and financial instruments from citizens and organizations to benefit national capabilities and fuel underground crime. The U.S. is also susceptible to two acute damage scenarios. First, many of us worry about attacks against critical infrastructure. The electrical grid, financial sector, water supply, and telecommunications systems are the big four targets. To date, according to public testimony and public news reporting, some foreign actors have already infiltrated elements of critical infrastructure, while others have attempted to disrupt critical infrastructure. The second acute damage scenario involves disruption or destruction of virtual infrastructure. And we have 2 public examples where foreign actors have infiltrated American companies and destroyed data on thousands of computers. I'd like to talk briefly about the 4 big threat actors, and without probably any surprise, they'll be the same ones mentioned by my colleagues. We worry about nation-states, organized criminals, terrorists, and activists. There is some overlap and mixing of these groups, but if we're able to handle the top end, the nation-states, our abilities will sort of flow down and cover the others. So I'd like to talk briefly about the 4 big nation-state actors: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And I'll mention that just in the last year and a half alone, Mandiant has responded to intrusions by all 4 countries, including the big public ones I'm sure you're aware of. Russia poses acute and chronic challenges. Russian government forces can conduct full-spectrum information operations, and they possess top-tier cyber capabilities, including the ability to preserve their operational security and frustrate forensic analysis. China also poses chronic and acute challenges. They can conduct full-spectrum information operations, although not at the Russian level. Unfortunately, what they lack in their top-tier capability, they make up for in volume and persistence. For example, the Chinese theft of commercial and sensitive data from American companies is unequaled. In my 18 years of doing this work, I've never seen anything like it. Turning to the other 2 big threat actors, North Korea and Iran, both of them primarily pose acute challenges. In other words, the ability to conduct a short, sharp attack. We've seen this now with the North Koreans, or at least forces that were under their control, with the attack against Sony Pictures Entertainment in November of 2014. Iran has a similar capability. In fact, they conducted a virtual destruction action against the Sands Casino in February of 2014. Both of these countries have geopolitical risks associated with them, which makes it perhaps more likely that they would use a cyber attack to compensate for their military deficiencies. I'd like to conclude by mentioning that I hope during the hearing we can talk about some alternative strategies to deal with these threats, primarily shifting from a strategy, at least in the government, of closing the barn door after the horses have left, to one of actively looking for intruders that are already in the network. And also, hopefully, moving to a situation where if you lose your Social Security number, there's really no way to recover from that, to one where there are business processes that can accommodate the loss of personal data. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes of questions. The testimony we hear is quite sobering. I imagine everyone on the panel and everyone here today has received a letter that has said your personal information has been compromised. I think I've received 4 letters in the last 8 months. The first one I received was quite disturbing. Sadly, we're just getting used to the fact that our information continues to be compromised. Is anyone's information, is any information safe? Whether we're talking about personal information, we're talking about programs in the federal government? To the panel, Mr.
Sure.
Silifo.
Yep. Richard, do you want to jump?
Sure, I'll take a quick shot at it. So I would argue that history has shown that no data is potentially safe. We are talking, if you're talking at the very end of our capabilities in the government, you have the risk of insiders like Mr. Snowden or Chelsea Manning. In the private sector, you've got nation-state actors going after private companies. And from my own personal experience, it takes a sustained effort by a private company to simply hold off a nation-state, or at least to detect when they've gotten into your company so that you can kick them out quickly. So it is very difficult to protect information at all.
Mr. Chairman, to build on that, I think we will never be in a position to say we can prevent all attacks. But there are steps we can take to mitigate the consequences and the potential damage by segmenting and segregating certain information in different sorts of networks. And that starts looking inside, understanding your family jewels, understanding what matters most to either A, a company, or B, a government, or whatever it may be. But to Richard's point, how many companies, even the biggest in the world, went into business thinking they had to defend themselves against foreign intelligence services? That's precisely what's happening. The current approach is, by definition, reactive. Every time we get hit, instead of calling the police, we call the locksmith. We're building higher walls, getting bigger locks. At the end of the day, that, by definition, is doomed for failure. It's reacting, reacting, reacting. We've got to push the equation in a different kind of way, and happy to touch on some thoughts during Q&A.
And I think that goes to Mr. Madden's point, where he was talking about not just being on defense, he was talking about being on offense. And one, we look to the federal government, not just for defense. I don't know if we're doing any offensive measures or not. But is there a role for the private sector, do you think, Mr. Madden, in the offensive play, not just defense?
I do, and I think it's very varied. I don't think there's just one approach. I think first it starts, as was mentioned earlier, with information sharing. I mean, that's a critical component, but that's not the only component. It's how you share information. And part of that information sharing relationship between the government and the private sector has to start with safe harbor. Can't tell you how many times I hear folks from the financial sector want to share information with the government, but they're concerned about liability. And that liability, I think, before true information sharing occurs, that liability needs to be addressed.
Could I build on that? Because, I mean, think about it. Cybercrime is the only crime I know of where we blame the victim. I mean, every other crime you blame the perpetrator. In this case, we're blaming the victim. And I'm not suggesting that companies can and must do more. But at the end of the day, they're up against an adversary that is very sophisticated and will require at least the rules of the road. I'm not ready for sanctioning companies to necessarily hack back, but there's a whole bit of policy space between hacking back and doing nothing but being reactive and building higher walls. Proactive forensics collection. This is key. Think about it in a football analogy. You have linebackers. Yes, they're defending against other people trying to score on your system, but they're blitzing the quarterback. There's more we can do in that environment as well, whether it's through technologies, but most importantly, we need to define the rules of the road, because right now, if companies were to engage in this, they'd be breaking laws, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in particular. I think that does require some updating and close examination.
And my main point is, let's get the conversation started. Let's really have a robust conversation with our nation, with ourselves, about what it looks like for the private sector to really track and even disrupt cyber attacks in certain instances to defend their systems. And
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
No, go ahead. You can finish your thought.
And of course, it would not happen overnight. I think there's no expectation of that. And it would require a defendable attribution regime. But as our technology gets increasingly more precise, the ability to attribute the location of these attacks it becomes more enhanced.
Thank you. And I have several more questions, but my time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cleaver for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All three of you make profound statements with which I agree, and thank you for being here. Does the United States engage in hacking into systems around the world?
Well, sir, it depends what you mean by hacking. It has been reported in the press, and I think, as you'd expect, there are traditional intelligence operations that the U.S. government conducts, as every other country does. The significant difference, though, for the United States is that we don't steal commercial secrets and then give them to our domestic companies for the purposes of commercial advantage.
Yeah, the only reason I asked the question because I'm following up on something that was said earlier, and that is when we discover that a nation is in fact hacking into our commercial operations or into the Pentagon, which I think has been done a couple of times. I'm just wondering about the response, in a way that's more than saying, we know you did it, and which is what I think we said recently. I mean, that wouldn't stop me from robbing 7-Eleven if I were a 7-Eleven robber. Somebody said, well, Cleaver, I know you did it.
Sir, I think that's precisely the point. You highlighted the essential problem, which is it's incredibly ambiguous what exactly we're doing as a nation when our most valuable, our treasures are being stolen from us, left, right, and center. And I think having a transparent, concrete plan to address those issues is sorely needed.
Congressman, if I can build on that just a teeny bit. clearly we need to penalize the perpetrators and the adversaries from this behavior and change their behaviors. To me, that does require articulating a clear cyber deterrence strategy to deter, compel, and dissuade. Obviously, that's going to take on different instruments and instrumentalities based on A, both the perpetrator, and B, the incident itself. But I feel we do have to be more transparent and be willing to speak about leaning forward. What good is having the doomsday machine if no one knows you got it? At the end of the day, of course, the United States has a capability, but we use it in a very sophisticated and measured, commensurate kind of way. To Richard's point, a number of these countries are doing it to benefit their companies. That's an unfair playing field, and U.S. companies are penalized greatly by the perceived and or real sins of others, and we're getting our shirts cleaned in this case. So I do feel there is a way, and there are other instruments that can be brought to bear, both proactive but also sanctions. The administration recently promulgated an executive order that allows for using economic sanctions against cyber perpetrators. I think it's going to be put to the test real soon. We'll see how it plays out in reality if we can translate those nouns into verbs.
Someone hit on this earlier, but is it possible, do we in fact have the technology now, or are we capable of producing the technology that would create a zero-fail system?
Sir, in my experience, there is no such thing as an unhackable system. And I think that's what you mean by zero fail.
Yes. So, go ahead, Mr. Madden.
And likewise, there will never be a system or a condition where attribution will be 100%. That's also an ideal. But I think it's a matter of weighing risks. And this revolution in attribution, where technologies are advancing to the extent where we're very confident that certain attacks originated from a certain state actor, for example. I think that we're getting to a place where we can be comfortable with the amount of risk that we're taking on.
Well, after North Korea hacked into our system, Kim publicly says that didn't happen, we didn't do it. And so I was hoping on the next day we could produce some indisputable evidence, yes, you did it, and here's how we know you did it. Does that exist?
That's the Treasury model, sir. That's precisely what we did with illicit finance. And we confronted those nation-state actors with declassified intelligence and said, yes, you did.
Can I build on that? Because I'm going to throw a compliment to Richard's direction. I mean, Mandiant, in their report on China and their activity, that was the smoking keyboard. Very difficult to discern, but they did demonstrate smoking keyboards. You're starting to see attribution improve dramatically, never to 100%, because the smart actors are using proxies. They want the veneer of plausible deniability if they get their hands caught in the cookie jar. But there are other means than simply cyber forensics to get information on who's doing what. So we have other intelligence capabilities that can be brought to bear.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Smoking keyboard, it's a great analogy. The chairman recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick. He's the vice chair of this committee and the chairman of the task force to investigate terror financing for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Mr. Saluja, the four nation states that you mentioned in your opening statement, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, it seems like every time you talk about nation states and cyber terrorism, those are the four nations that sort of roll off your tongue. And I was wondering if you can discuss how each of those nations decide or select the subject of the attack and how it may differentiate between the four of them.
Excellent question. I mean, and not an easy answer, because it's going to come in various sizes and forms. So China, we heard, and I think Richard said it's a numbers game. They have so many bodies they can throw at the problem that they're quite sophisticated, deeply involved in not only military application of cyber capability, but obviously in economic and industrial espionage. Russia, I think, is the more sophisticated actor of those two. They are integrating cyber into not only their warfighting, but into their intelligence apparatus, which often includes human intelligence, according to the U.S. National Counterintelligence Directorate of a couple years ago. They lean so heavily on, and it's worth touching on proxies. So in China, we know of military officers who are moonlighting. After work hours, they're doing business for others. In Russia, what you have is more a criminal underground that they turn a blind eye, but when the government wants them, they do their bidding, which is maybe very different than Iran, for example, who is turning to its hacking underground, the Ashiyan network, the Basij. They're actually co-opting them into the fold of their activity, which is very different. So, I mean, when the stakes are really high, the country that, and it's worth noting, so computer network exploit or espionage, computer network attack is using attack modes. If you can exploit, you can attack. And there have been article after article after article of countries that have done the cyber equivalent intelligence preparation of the battlefield of, say, our electric grid. That has no economic value, but it has significant value in a national security kind of setting. So I am concerned that if the intent shifts, the capability goes up exponentially. Now, Iran, North Korea, they're less constrained, perhaps, by some of this activity. So they are going to be going to the cyber drive-by shooting equivalent, which is easily built because the bar is low, and also a more sophisticated capability. And it's worth noting, these are the countries we talk about. Every country that has a modern military has a cyber capability as well, so it's worth noting that.
Is it possible to know really whether the attack is coming from the state sponsor or from just a group of private hackers, say, within Russia?
That is the $64,000 question. So the 07 attacks on Estonia, was that driven by the Kremlin? I think the messaging was driven by the Kremlin, but I think in this case you actually had criminal actors engage in that activity. So that's where some of this forensics collection becomes so important.
Do you have an opinion as to the number of prosecutions or actions brought by the administration in response to cyber attacks?
Not nearly enough. I mean, right now we are penalizing the victims. So I actually think that in Russia's case, so you've got a small number of actors who are responsible for developing most of the tools that are being used in the underground, or the malware, or the botnets that are being rented. If we could go after, I recently had the head of Europol in, and he said 80% of their attacks are coming from Russian-speaking countries. He had claimed there are about 150 super hackers. Maybe instead of spending billions of dollars on our cybersecurity, we should aggressively pursue those 150 hackers.
Mr. Madden, on the subject of the financial institutions, clearly there's a public role in coordinating response and defenses, and a purely private role as well. But within the financial institutions, we have to encourage the institutions to be communicating with each other, to support each other, but also within individual institutions. Is there a challenge of divisions of certain, say, bigger banks or related banks in different countries, even within those institutions talking to each other?
So, of course, that's the case, sir. But I think that the decision by many global financial institutions to create these financial intelligence units that cross the different verticals within the bank is a terrific effort. And I'm seeing more and more of those units being created and being empowered and properly funded.
My time's expired.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. And thank you to our expert witnesses here today. I'm not sure how I feel. I guess I wanted you to be able to answer Congressman Duffy's question by saying, yes, that some of our information is protected and safe, and we could work through this and come up with a fail-safe system. But that does not appear to be the case yet. We have a lot of history about cyber attacks. As I recall, in February, James Clapper, the Director of the National Intelligence, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And in that testimony, he said that in the future, we might see more cyber operations that will change or manipulate electronic information in order to compromise its integrity, that is, its accuracy and reliability, instead of deleting or disrupting access to it. And obviously, as members of this subcommittee who oversee the financial regulators, part of our role is to ensure the integrity of financial information. So I'd like to know whether the panel agrees with Director Clapper's assessment of future cyber operations to manipulate data, and if you do, what can our financial institutions and regulators do to combat such attacks to ensure the prevention of manipulation of financial data?
Yes, ma'am, I agree with that assessment. The manipulation of data such that there's an effect but no one really understands what happened, that's the top end of the problem. The way to counter that, and honestly the way to counter all these problems, in my opinion, is to have a strategy that relies on detecting the infiltration before the adversary completes the mission. In other words, we currently have delays of upwards of 200 days or so between when an intruder gets into a network and someone notices. And the someone noticing, 2/3 of the time, is the FBI. That needs to change. We need to have a much tighter window so that when an intruder gets into the network, someone notices quickly and cuts them off before they accomplish their mission. So although we can't stop everyone from getting to the data, if we can stop them before they change it, steal it, destroy it, then we win.
I also agree with General Clapper, the ODNI, on that. I would say there's another half of that equation, which is actually more disturbing. I mentioned this briefly, and that's the insider threat. And so an insider threat can be a malicious employee who started at an organization feeling great about the financial institution and then somewhere along the line became disgruntled. It could be a compromise system, or it could be a very sloppy employee. And I think focusing these efforts also on the insider threat and understanding your employee. Financial institutions are becoming and are experts at knowing your customer. They're required to do that. I think it's time to also expand that to include know your employee.
Okay.
Sadly, I too agree, and we've actually seen it based in recent public cases as well, that the data has been manipulated. But I think in terms of your oversight responsibilities, if I may be so presumptuous, I mean, what makes this committee so significant is a sustained campaign against our banks, markets, clearinghouses, or other areas is the potential to erode trust and confidence in our very systems itself. Okay. It's all about perception, and that's with markets, and that can include data manipulation, but there are backups. There are ways where you can stave off the bleeding, and I think both the other witnesses said there's a lot more we can do in terms of detection. And I might note, of all the sectors of our critical infrastructures, yours is so much further along than others. I'm actually worried about regional banks more than I am Wall Street. It's Main Street. It's all the regional banks and financial institutions outside of Wall Street that are going to be the primary targets.
Okay, and thank you. Let me, in my few seconds left, two of you mentioned in your testimony with corporations being at the tip of the spear, and the question was related to public and private partnerships. What are the tools that they need in private sector? And if we start regional banks at a lower level, what are the tools they need to be in the game to help themselves and us with this?
You know, the financial services sector has what's called the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the FSI-SAC. It is the gold standard of information sharing and analysis centers. They've even gone so far as having automated information sharing in terms of known signatures and IP addresses through an entity called Soltra. So I think that we need to expand that beyond some of the bigger financial institutions to others, but there is a model to turn to, and it's one that's actually working.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our panelists for being with us here today. As we've all discussed, cybersecurity is quickly becoming one of the largest threats to our country and carries severe national and economic security concerns. The studies have shown the number of security incidents in the U.S. every day range in the hundreds of thousands, and we seem to learn of a new major cyber breach almost every week. Earlier this year, millions of customers with health insurer Anthem had their personal information compromised, and just recently, as we've discussed over and over again, and will be in briefings later on today, the Office of Personnel Management announced that millions of confidential records on current and former federal government employees have been compromised. Not only does this represent a major threat and breach of privacy for the individuals whose information is compromised, but it hampers our ability to gather intelligence, I think, abroad, and empowers and emboldens foreign governments, many of whom are behind these attacks. In both of these instances that I mentioned before, we know the attacks are attributed to China, to their cyber unit that engineered the attack. However, what we don't know is how is the U.S. and our government responding and helping prevent attacks like this in the future. Now, you all have talked about a number of risk factors out there and things that are being done, but clearly current actions by the United States to address specifically Chinese and Russian cyberspace capabilities is not sufficient. And I never, ever like it when the U.S. government is in a reactive mode. Nor do I like to hear that it takes upwards of 200 days to notice an intruder. As some of you talked about building, we just seem to be reacting, building that firewall higher and higher, yet, wow, why is it taking upwards of 200 days for us to notice, recognize an intruder? Anyone who would like to answer?
Sure. I couldn't agree with you more, ma'am. So certain things we can do. One is, as I mentioned, enhancing 314B of the U.S. Patriot Act, and it'll allow financial institutions to share information about cyber-related financial activity within their sector without liability. So enhancing those safe harbor provisions are absolutely critical to that. Two is
Mr.
accelerating.
Madden, let me interrupt. I believe the House has moved on that through CISPA, and on a voluntary basis has agreed for that kind of sharing, both within industry and with the government, if they voluntarily choose to. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think the safe harbor, not just trends of cyber information, but specific pointed information that banks can share with each other.
Right.
So expanding it not just between the private institutions and the government, but also within and among financial institutions.
Without liability.
So what I'm saying is start the conversation and figure out a way to enable that. Because if there isn't a conversation and a sort of a template that banks and financial sector institutions can use, then the information simply isn't going to flow. So I'm not saying it's easy, ma'am, and it would take quite a bit of thought, but I think that if the conversation begins and bringing in the private sector to come up with creative solutions, there's a possibility.
I think you're right. Let me ask you also, Mr. Madden, while I'm at it, are there currently adequate international frameworks in place governing nation states' use of cyber attacks?
So in short, no, I think there aren't. But I think what we can do is, again, look at the Treasury model and look at the Financial Action Task Force as a model, which is an international body which sets international standards and norms on anti-money laundering and counting the financing of terrorism and proliferation financing. We can use that FATF model in the cyber context as a way of bringing in nation states to work in a FATF-type body and assess implementation and effectiveness of international norms and standards.
Just could I add just
yes,
very
please.
briefly, I mean, there are some initiatives out there. The Council of Europe, for example, has the Cybercrime Convention, which I think is at least a starting point in terms of inducing changes in behavior. But I think the bigger issue here is we do need to articulate a clear deterrence strategy, and we don't deter cyber. we deter actors. So it will have to have a deterrence strategy that is focused on all the different perpetrators and actors and what the commensurate penalties and response will be. So I think there is an awful lot that needs to be done, and I think we actually need new cyber alliances. Let's start with our Five Eyes community, the US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Build that out to our transatlantic partners in Europe. Then start building that out to allies in Asia, Japan, Korea, in the Middle East, Israel, and on it goes. We haven't really had those conversations in a significant kind of way.
Thank you very, very much. I apologize for going over, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for having this discussion. It was interesting today that some of the words that came out, smoking keyboards, stop the bleeding, doomsday machine. I mean, it almost seems like a 60s movie in some ways. Hopefully it has a happy ending. One of the things that did strike me was that you said we need to have a robust discussion in our country, and I think we are starting to have that, to be frank. Everyone's afraid of losing their personal information, especially their Social Security number. And we need to penalize the cyber criminals. I think that gets tough if they're, if they're the top-ranked, these nations, these foreign nations. I mean, that is a difficult situation, and we need to lean forward. We have the capabilities, the doomsday machine. What doomsday machine? I'm not familiar with any doomsday machine. What, Mr. Souffleur, I think you were the one that mentioned the doom. We have the doom. What doomsday? What are you talking about?
It was meant to demonstrate that we have offensive capabilities that can be brought to bear as well. And if you don't articulate and to some extent be transparent about that, our perpetrators
Well, let's talk about that, because I think what you meant is maybe disrupt them. In other words, if they're disrupting us, we disrupt them more. Is that what you mean? Or what do you mean by these capabilities? I mean, one thing is trying to find out who they are, and it sounds like we have the capabilities to do that, to figure out now who are the perpetrators, and it seems like we're getting better and better at that. So we find out it's Russia, what do we do?
That's way after the fact, though. So to Richard's point, there's steps that can be taken left of boom, or in this case, before an actual breach and or incident occurs. And in terms of some of our capabilities, sometimes all you need to do is demonstrate that, and that has a net deterrent effect or can dissuade. It can raise the stakes, make the penalties high, that they may decide not to engage in this activity. So what we're really talking about is inducing changes in behavior. If people feel that they can get away with this, and get away with this in a wanton kind of way, you're going to see more and more and more and more activity. So the point is how do we shift that equation where you raise the costs?
Sir, if I could just quickly say, this is sort of like an American football game where you have the Patriots versus the Broncos. Tom Brady plays against the Broncos defense, and Peyton Manning plays against the Patriots defense. We need our Tom Brady going against their Peyton Manning. In other words, our offense disrupting their offense.
I like the football analogies. I mean, I was a linebacker. I like the blitzing linebacker. Yeah, it's fun to tackle the quarterback. But I guess my question really is this: it seems like you can figure out who these guys are, but then how do you punish them? Really, honestly, at the end of the day, I mean, how do you go and you punish them? You have all these companies in China that are stealing our information. How do you, at the end of the day, punish them other than strict sanctions? I mean, how do you do that?
Well, sir, at the operational level, I have seen these guys attacking targets and slowing down and not being able to accomplish their mission because of friction introduced by the defender. If you are an attacker and someone is suddenly attacking your system, kicking you off the target, kicking you off your own system, maybe deleting your system, that raises the cost quite a bit. And many times we think that these guys are 10 feet tall and bulletproof. They're guys who are sitting in uniform, 18 years old, following a script, essentially.
Let me get to one thing I did want to get to before my time runs out, and that is, you did talk about Social Security. Someone's Social Security number was hacked, that there should be some protocols in place or something to be able to put that person back to where he or she was. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, because I think people are very interested in that.
Yes, sir. So when you steal a credit card and you lose your credit card, there's basically no cost to recover from that. When you lose your Social Security number, when you use your health care records, I don't know how you recover from that. You're looking at an unbounded cost. We need to replace the Social Security number with something that, if it's public, it doesn't matter. We need to move to a system where we acknowledge that if data gets out, there's a way for the customer to recover from that. And right now, when the Social Security number is used as a method of identification and authentication, if you know my social, you can log into websites, essentially. That has to be changed.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Because I think that is important, something that a little thinking outside of the box. Madden, would you like to comment on that, sir?
No, sir, sorry. On your former point, I would say you mentioned sanctions, and I just point to the incredible work that the executive branch and Congress did with
you know, if
sanctions
I could
against Iran.
interrupt you for just 1 second. One of the things that was interesting, I'm from California. Of course, we have great capabilities there. But the FBI, the Treasury has been named over and over again as models of doing a good job. Private companies are also. And I think that's important to note because it seems today that we're talking mostly about the good work that the federal government has done, but California, I also want to...
Mr. Vargas, could I just pick up on that? Because I actually think the future is within the private sector, and not only domestically, but also in cooperation, concerted efforts with others.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Tipton from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you bringing up the Broncos and the Patriots. I'm out of Colorado. So, was actually this very disturbing, obviously, in terms of the real threats that we're going to be facing as a country. And Mr. Sofolo, you were talking about penalizing the victims, and I happen to agree with that. You know, we're going after the banks you didn't, or even the Home Depot, I think, that was cited earlier, in terms of the testimony, as opposed to the culprits that are actually perpetrating the crime. But a lot of my concern that I see is when we're looking at the Chinese as an example, we've heard the reports that they've got our plans for the F-35. They're able, not only coming at it from an economic standpoint, but also from a military standpoint as well. And we're talking about the doomsday machine. When we're staying with the football end of this, it's often said that the best offense is a good defense. And so I understand being proactive. How do we find that proper balance? And as a nation, shouldn't we be incredibly concerned if they're able to get into our military-industrial complex to be able to steal some of our best technology, and then we move into the financial end of the world to where our bank accounts are going to be exploited, and then we can shut down the electrical grid as well. How do we get those components together to be able to be on the offense?
Sir, that's a great concern, and I actually share the view that the private sector is very much part of the solution to that. Some of the forms that I mentioned earlier are a rewards program for groups to uncover, identify, and deliver cyber hackers to U.S. courts and authorities, empowering the victims of attacks to sue the perpetrators, and those benefiting directly from cyber infiltrations, just as victims of terrorist attacks can do so today. And also unleashing cyber forensic teams and private litigants and plaintiffs' lawyers against those attacking U.S. systems.
Now, what are we going to do? There's something called sleeper malware that can be put into a system to be activated at a later time. When we're identifying some of the threats that are going to be in place against us, if it's just sitting there, it's late and it's not doing anything, can we identify that now?
Congressman, that's actually an excellent point, because most breaches today occur or through vulnerabilities in your supply chain or third-party vendors. And until you start looking at this issue holistically, that is a legitimate vulnerability we need to be thinking about. I might also note, though, the defense industrial base, they do have unique pilots vis-a-vis information sharing with the public and the private sector, with government, along with the financial services sector. I think they're up there. But even they, as we saw, have been successfully hacked, whether it's RSA, you name the entity, they've been hacked to one extent or another. I'm going to take a different approach. I think the economic instruments here could be very valuable and useful. I actually think China long-term will have enough to lose that they will recognize that there is some change in behavior that they need to consider and think about. Unfortunately, it's not there now. They're seeing immediately in front of them, why spend billions in R&D if we can just steal it and spend it on gaining market share? But at some point, they will have market share that they're really concerned about, that I do think that could level it out a little bit, which is different than actors that want to cause harm, so that are driven, and I'm not suggesting China doesn't, because they are investing in military technologies as well, but that's something we need to be thinking about.
Do we have an issue as a country when we're having software, as an example, maybe being written in China, coming into our country, and then we start bringing into the component of it, trust your employees. We've got technology that we're using in our systems right now that's being written overseas. Is that something we need to examine?
Yes, sir, that's absolutely a concern. And in fact, the top-end attackers, when they realize they can't get into a target technically using a cyber component, they try to get their nationals hired as programmers in sensitive companies.
And secure coding, that's something the U.S. ought to be investing in. I mean, if we built planes the way we code for software, none of us would ever fly. So at the end of the day, there are initiatives from a STEM education standpoint that we can be looking at in terms of secure coding and the like.
There are companies out there like my own, which is looking very much at the inside threat, which a compromised system would be, so that when that malicious software fires up, that it's identified within the system. So there are tools and techniques out there to identify those problems. Not foolproof, but they exist and getting better.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses as well and appreciate greatly your testimony. You've spoken of an offensive tactic or strategy, if you will, and what you seem to be saying is rather than have a firewall, create a backfire, fire back, be offensive. Let people know that there are penalties, that there is a price to pay for encroaching upon our technology and our systems, our software. Now, is the technology currently available such that we can, while without attribution, without the certainty of attribution, attack the source without having actual attribution?
Sir, the U.S. government has unique attribution capabilities to trace all the way back to the true source of an activity. This is probably one of the few areas I disagree with my co-panelists in that I don't feel that it's the role of the private sector to be doing hackback. We can enable attribution, we can help through our own forensic investigations figure out what's happening, but I'd much rather see the private sector engage in finding intruders and removing them quickly and leave the power of striking back at the adversary as part of the state's monopoly of force.
If we have this unique ability to strike back at the point of origin, what is it that causes us to hesitate, if indeed we are hesitating?
Congressman, I mean, firstly, for the record, I don't advocate hacking back. I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of proactive forensics collection. But one thing, and you used fire back, I look at it more as suppressive fire. So you're protecting your systems. The challenge with some of the technologies...
Well, excuse me if I may. I really am not talking about suppressive fire. I appreciate your point.
No, I was saying
I understand, but what I would like to know is what can we do to the hacker that is actually attacking our system? Why can we not, if we know that the point of origin is a certain place, why can't we go to that place and take offensive action as opposed to continuing to be on the defense?
Sir, at a minimum, we can remove them from the formal financial sector. We can...
No. I'm talking about attack that system. Why? What is it that prevents us, as a part of our countermeasures? Our defense becomes an offense of attacking that system that is attacking us.
Friendly fire, because there could be innocent along. In other words, they're exploiting other systems that you would be taking down, and God forbid one manages a hospital in Pyongyang or whatever it may be.
Well, I needed to hear that.
Sir, I think there's also a gain loss in the intel community that says they would much rather watch the fireworks than let the adversary know that they see the fireworks by interfering with their systems. So that might be some resistance that has to be overcome.
All right, let's talk about credit cards for just a moment. It's my understanding that you can go online and buy credit card information. I'm interested in seeing this actually happen, see a demonstration of this kind of activity. I understand that if you're sophisticated enough, you're supposed to be able to do this, and people are actually buying credit card numbers and they're buying Social Security cards. Is there any place available to members, or more specifically to me, so that I can get a demonstration of how this actually works?
Sir, there are companies out there that investigate this sort of behavior. It's not something we do at FireEye. You may actually be able to find some banks who will show this, because one of the ways they validate that they've been hacked is to go out and buy a sample of these credit cards to determine if it came from their system, and by doing so, they initiate a response.
Are these available, the credit card information? Is this information available to just anybody? Can anybody go online and find this information and buy so that I can steal another person's identity, actually buy this information? Is it available?
It is available, but you tend to have to be a vetted person who is brought in by another criminal.
It's referred to as the dark web, so there is the cyber equivalent of black markets. And it's worth noting that credit card data is now going for cents on the dollar, whereas healthcare records are going for much more, because the potential to commit fraud and the likelihood of getting caught is less. And also worth noting, in particular, they're going after children's health records, because they're not checking their credit until they're 18, so you could have 10 years of fraud committed against you.
Are you of the opinion that the penalties for identity theft are sufficient? Do we have sufficient mandatory penalties? Do we need stiffer penalties for identity theft?
Sir, I think the penalties probably are harsh enough. We just had a prosecution of someone who ran something called the Silk Road, and he essentially got life in prison for running an underground site.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, very much. I appreciate it, and thank you, gentlemen, for all being here today. This is a very sobering exercise for a lot of us who are not experts in the area that you folks are in. We have to, as a country, I believe, stay on offense when it comes to a lot of these issues, and Congresswoman Wagner commented on that a little bit. And what I've heard today, where you have not only terrorist organizations and you have organized crime, but you also have actually sovereign states. You have countries that are supporting cyber attacks against our infrastructure, our health insurance companies, our cell phone companies, our military installations. And this is, as we all know, very serious stuff. It threatens our way of life, our economy, jobs. And when our economy can't function because of these sort of threats, then we can't generate the tax revenues we need to defend ourselves. This is really, really serious stuff, and there is a big cost to this, and I understand that. I don't understand all the specifics, but I understand there's a huge cost to our country in doing this. So in anything in life, any organization, you need to have leadership. And if you have leadership and you marshal the resources of a country like ours to address a problem, I'm certain we can do that. And it sounds like we are not doing that, and we are not staying on offense in a coordinated way as much as we can be. So my question to you, and I'll start with each of you who would like to go first, Mr. Salufo, am I pronouncing it right? Close enough. Okay, thanks. If you were the President of the United States, and you control 1/3 of our government, and you were the Commander-in-Chief, what would be the one thing that you would do to fix this problem?
It's a great question. I wish there were one silver bullet I could turn to address this, but by and large, I would look at owning the interagency piece, do all that we can to enhance not only our own cybersecurity, but also demonstrate our capability, articulate a deterrence strategy, articulate the penalties, follow through. There are a lot of nouns, not a whole lot of verbs. We've got to follow through. These bright lines are being transgressed regularly. And more importantly, I'd find ways to build on the private sector's capability.
Okay, let's drill down a little bit more, if I may, Mrs. Saluja. You know, we're not the only country that has this problem. We know who the bad actors are, right? Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran when it comes to state sponsoring of these cyber attacks. So other developed nations across the world have these same problems. A lot of our friends in Europe, for example, and in the Pacific Rim. So my question is, wouldn't part of this activity to stay on offense as a country, to protect our homeland, protect our economy and our way of life and our freedom, wouldn't it include coordination with other
Unequivocally.
free-loving people around the world?
Unequivocally.
And that can be done, correct?
It can and
it
must
has not been done, correct?
Not to the extent it needs to be done.
Mr. Madden, what do you think if you were the President of the United States and you had all these resources at your disposal, what would you do?
I would call a meeting together with my staff and say, what authorities do I have to hit them back hard, and do it publicly, very publicly.
And that would include, clearly, because you mentioned this before, dealing with international law or the development thereof to make sure that those that are responsible for this are held accountable. Because in many cases, it seems to me that we probably have the resources to find out who these people are. We certainly know who the countries are, correct?
Absolutely, sir.
Mr. Bajak?
Sir, I would first accept that the government is compromised. We need to go out there and find these guys now. We have to do that.
When you say the government is compromised, do you mean in a case like China or Russia? Is that what you mean?
There are intruders in the network. We need to go out there, find them, and kick them out. And that'll be the first message we send, is that we see you and we're doing something about it.
And we have the resources to do that, in your opinion?
I don't know, sir, if we have the resources necessary. That would need to be something to add to.
Do we need anything, hear anything in Congress? Do you have the legislative support that you need, or anything else we can do in Congress to make sure that we have an opportunity to stay on offense with respect to this?
I think a reinterpretation of the FISMA law that focuses more attention on detecting and responding to intruders and less on building up the walls might be necessary.
Okay, great. Anything else from any of you fellas? I appreciate very much you being here. Help us, educate us, keep this country on offense to stop this. Mr. Chair, I yield my time. Thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of the subcommittee may participate in today's hearing for the purposes of making an opening statement and asking questions. We do have Mr. Royce from the full committee and also Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Royce, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thought, well, first let me thank you, Chairman Duffy, but because we're looking at this same issue in the Foreign Affairs Committee, I thought I would pursue a line of questioning here, some questions that, they're brief questions, but they are a little complicated. But I'll start with Mr. Saluja and ask him what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace.
I'm not sure we have enough time for me to try to explain.
Try to be succinct.
You know, if it does affect our national and economic security and it's driven by a nation-state actor, Article 5 could be triggered. For example, in a NATO context, if Russia engaged in a computer network attack against Lithuania, that doesn't have to be a military attack. It can also be on civilian infrastructures.
So in terms of our obligations with NATO, you see the possibility here that cyber war and cyber terrorism, or the actions taken, well, depending upon the extent of it, could be so interpreted.
Absolutely. I mentioned earlier Five Eyes, NATO, transatlantic, and then bilats with Korea, Japan.
So you're listing a lot of treaties here that where it's an interesting question, because obviously, with the case of North Korea hacking into the banking system of South Korea, you had that special bureau in North Korea. It gets even more complicated, because I think those individuals were doing some training up in Moscow. I think they were training them. But as we dig deeper and deeper into this, this is sort of the tripwire that we're discussing here, because they were intending to bring down the banking system in South Korea, and in fact did quite a job of making it impossible for a few days for that to work. I always wondered where they got the expertise in North Korea to do that. But who in the administration decides what is an act of cyber war or cyber terrorism or cyber vandalism, as the President called that Sony hack, cyber vandalism? Who makes that decision in terms of differentiating how we designate one of these assaults?
Sir, from what I've seen, it's the President's call.
Mm-hmm. And how, if at all, is the administration responding differently between cyber attacks from inside the United States to those that are generated from outside the border of the United States?
Sir, from the perspective of attacks that are conducted by people in the United States, we generally have the law enforcement capability to find them, apprehend them, and prosecute them, which is a capability that does have some effect here.
Does this call into question whether, the Pentagon should have the capability, if this is, as you have indicated, sort of an act of war at a certain point, that we should, like once upon a time, Billy Mitchell, sort of drove our policy by dropping that test bomb on that battleship closer than he was supposed to make the point that we needed an Air Force. We needed a new branch of the service, basically, because this was going to be a new form of warfare. And along came Pearl Harbor and proved, wow, Billy Mitchell really, he may have been court-martialed for it, but he was absolutely right. We needed a separate branch. We needed an Air Force. Are we in a situation now where, because, and let's face it, we've got advance warning on this in terms of what Iran intends and what some of the other actors intend, to say nothing of some of the terrorist organizations that now call themselves a state. They've announced that this is a cheap way for them to carry out war against the infidel or war against the United States.
Yes, sir.
To quote ISIS. So are we at that point where we need to consider this in terms of our national security in the same way during World War II that it dawned on us that we needed a separate branch of the service, the Air Force, in order to handle a new mode of warfare?
Yes, sir. I tend to lean towards the creation of a cyber force, and I have some pending research on that topic.
Congressman Royce, if I can build on that, it really is about delineating the Title X activity within our armed services community. Right now, I think some of the intelligence activity trumps some of the Title X activity. I do think we've got to get to the point where we can stand up the combatant commands, and at some point, I at the very least see Cybercom being firstly a full combatant command, not part of strategic command, and also more in a Title X hat than its Title 50 hat, coupled with NSA.
And then that leads me to the next question, which is how far along is Moscow on this? I mean, if they're at the point now where they're taking from the North Korean bureau responsible for cyber attacks, taking students into Moscow and teaching them these capabilities. I've read this in the paper. I don't have the details on it, but it's pretty obvious that they got the training somewhere. I mean, if they're setting up and using proxies and have become that aggressive, how far along are they, apparently, in setting up a separate department and giving them this charge, this responsibility in terms of their offensive capability?
Sir, I think it's quite evident from the attacks that we've seen that they, the Chinese, and our adversaries are quite far along. And I think that our response needs to be vigorous and needs to be extremely public.
And we're behind them. In other words, we're not as far along as they are in terms of the defense of our. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity. Excellent topic. It builds on our committee hearing we had the other day on cybersecurity issues. I'm working 60 cases in Little Rock of doctors who have had their identity stolen for filing their tax returns this year. So it's a real life issue, and certainly in Little Rock, Arkansas. And One thing that struck me, we talk a lot around here, and we have our budget priorities, and the administration has their budget priorities of the flavor of the month, whether it's environment or something else. And yet, I think one of the biggest risks that we have are the IT systems of our federal government. And we haven't talked much about that today. The IRS, of course, their disclosure, I thought West Virginia was impenetrable, but perhaps not. And we had the HUD secretary in last week, and his IT system was probably put in when President Johnson was in office. So my question is, can you assess for me the risk we have with the data maintenance systems of our domestic agencies? Obviously, the OPM will have a classified briefing on today at 1 o'clock.
Yes, sir. I mean, I think it's unfortunately very apparent, right, that it is underfunded, it is under-resourced, and that there are true institutional challenges with those systems. It's a reminder that our information doesn't necessarily have to be highly classified to be critically important. And I think it calls for a funded comprehensive review of the risk exposure across the federal government. And I think what they'll find is that the vulnerabilities, there are standard vulnerabilities across the enterprise, but also specific vulnerabilities for each institution. And I think that the solutions have to be a funded mandate to take care of those risks and vulnerabilities. There are too often unfunded mandates that give confusing guidance to some of these institutions and departments, and I think a very crystal clear funded mandate to get these IT systems up to par is critical.
I agree with that, and I'm concerned on both sides of the aisle that there's a lot of, Congress likes to dole out punishment to executive branch agencies that are bad actors, of which there are many, and the list is long and painful. But in the IT and data security area, I think that's the wrong place for Congress to withhold critically needed funding, which affects all of our data. So I think we should be concerned about it. Mr. Silfo, you made a comment about regional and smaller banks. I'm a former CEO of and active in the regional banking arena. And, you know, next to consumer laws and credit quality, I'd say IT security is the #1 thing banks spend money and time on, both in their capital expenditure budgets and in their operating budget. I think if more businesses operated in that manner, we'd be a lot better off. So a second question on the federal systems, are they spending adequate time in penetration testing of our federal IT system, something we spent 24 hours a day and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on in my business?
No, I mean, firstly, and I also do think that the financial services sector serves as a model for other sectors of our critical infrastructure. But if you take J.P. Morgan, spending $250 million, had 1,000 people devoted, they did everything just right, and they still got hit. So at the end of the day, it's more than just resources. On the pen testing side, and I think my colleague said it just right, policy without resources is rhetoric. Most of the systems that we have today are built on weak foundations. In other words, you can have all the complex security, but if it's built on on quicksand, or if a home is built in a flood area, it's still going to get flooded no matter how advanced the system is. So I do think pen testing is critical, but I also think it has to be more than just the check-the-box kind of mentality. So it shouldn't just be advance warning. We all know there's going to be a pen test. There should be no warning pen tests that can be done in a simulated kind of way that doesn't affect the day-to-day operations of the organization. So exercise, 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 and exercise yet again is the answer.
And sir, just quickly, before you do the pen test, in other words, checking to see if you can get into the front door, you should go in the house and see who's already there.
Yeah. My time, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. If the panel would agree, the ranking member and I would like to do a second round. Just have a few more minutes. Thank you. The chair then yields himself 5 minutes. We have a lot of government agencies that collect information, and sometimes these agencies hold on to this information. Is the risk to Americans greater if not just their financial institution or their hospital has information, but not only the hospital or the financial institution, but also the government collects this information and houses it as well? Is that a double risk to the American citizen? that a yes?
Yes.
Yes.
I think that's as close to a factual statement, absolutely. And I think part of the challenge is it's currently not a thoughtful approach. Right? There's obviously information that should be kept and held, and I think, but it should not be rote. It should be something that's considered and thoughtful, and there should be a true look at what information we're holding and whether it's important or not.
And also, sir, a presumption that what happens if this data is stolen?
Exactly. So I want to hit, we only have 5 minutes, I want to hit a couple of different issues. So I would imagine that terrorist organizations maximize their capabilities against America and our allies. Whatever capability they have, they'll use against us. So if they have the capability of taking down an electric grid, they probably would, fair enough. So that they haven't done that, they probably don't have that capability yet. Is that a fair assumption on my part?
That is fair. The one flip side is they're so dependent for their own tradecraft on some of this that they may at least think about it in a calculated way. But yes, if they have the capability, they will use it.
But is it fair to say, too, that the Chinas and the Russias of the world probably have the capabilities of doing some catastrophic damage to critical infrastructure if they so choose?
You bet.
And so I want to give you all a chance. We have 3 minutes left. If we could quickly hear one about the dangers of hacking back. I know, Mr. Salufo, you don't agree with that. I don't know, Mr. Madden or Mr. Balak, quickly, do you guys think that's a good idea? Bad idea?
Government conducted operations, I'm okay with. Private sector, I would not be okay with.
Mr. Madden, you can be a contrarian if you want.
And I'm going to be somewhat.
I thought you would be.
And that is that I think it's important to start the conversation. And I understand that attribution is an incredibly important part of that conversation. But I think to just discredit the value that the private sector could bring to this fight without a really deep consideration, we do so at our own peril.
Okay.
And rules of the road are important here, Mr. Chairman. You need clarity. So before you do anything, you need to know what is off limits and what is acceptable behavior.
So you get a chance to talk to Congress. I'll ask each of you to give me the top 2 priorities that we should have in this institution to help protect and to fight back in this game of cyber war. What are 2 takeaways from each of you as a top priority?
Sir, my first priority would be find the guys who are already in the network and kick them out. And then secondly, based on what you learned during that exercise, figure out what you have to do in order to find them the next time they get in and kick them out faster, and then eventually get your defenses in order so that it's much less likely that they can get in the first place.
And did you say we don't have that capability, or you're not? Because obviously we would have kicked them out of OPM if we had the technology, right? So you're saying that has to be developed, that has to be a focus.
Right. We need to fund that sort of strategy and also the technology and bring it in to do that.
Great. Mr. Madden?
Explore offensive strategies that have worked in the past as a holistic government solution, and take those strategies and use them as a template for the next aggressive cyber campaign. That's 1. 2 is truly consider the insider threat, as my colleague was mentioned. It often gets short shrift in the cyber debate, so that should be highlighted.
So you're telling us think outside the box, use all the reasonable tools we have at our disposal.
Sir.
Mr. Salufo?
Firstly, to support, as my colleague just mentioned, some of our computer network attack capabilities to ensure that we continue to be the most sophisticated actor in this domain, provide the ability to articulate what a deterrent strategy is, and then should a perpetrator transgress, be willing to stand up in a unified kind of way to respond commensurately. And ultimately ensure that you have some of the members and staff that are technologically savvy and can serve as advisors at all times, because policy, technology, people, and you've got great people here, so lean on them.
Very well. Listen, I think this has been fascinating testimony, talking about our security. I think we might get through this hearing without you having to answer questions about servers in other locations, and it's, anyway. Mr. Ranking Member, Mr. Green, I yield you 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you need additional time, I'll... No, okay. Mr. Hill, permit me to thank you for indicating that technology is important and that we should be careful about how we raid some of these funds because I, too, am concerned about that approach. So I thank you for bringing it up and mentioning the latter part, which has to do with some of the actions that we take without going through regular order. Let me ask this of you. I understand the profile of the hacker. I understand that profile, and I'm talking now more specifically about identity theft. What I'm not sure of is the profile of the person who actually acquires the information in this dark world that we've been talking about and actually uses it. Is this a person who purchases 1,000 identities and proceeds with that 1,000 trying to do as much mischief as possible, or does a person acquire one identity and work that? What is the profile of the criminal mind and the criminal who does this?
Sir, I think using the one slice is there is no one profile. And if you take the OPM case, I'm pretty confident, wearing my former counterintelligence hat, that there are some very happy Chinese counterintelligence officers right now who are combing through our information to identify vulnerabilities in U.S. employees and trying to exploit those vulnerabilities for recruitment.
So is it your general consensus that this is the profile would not simply be a person who happens to live in the United States? Do we have people who live in our country who acquire this information and use it?
Yeah, there's certainly a criminal element as well. So I think each attack is very varied. I don't think there's one flavor. And I think it could either be used to sell on, as my colleagues were mentioning, the dark web. It could be used by a nation state to conduct counterintelligence activities. So I think there's a broad range of ways to use this critical information.
I'm concerned right now about people within the United States because you've talked about some of the sanctions that can be imposed. And while litigation is a possibility, when you're talking about litigation in a international setting, it can be quite difficult because of treaties and other things that would be necessary. But let's talk about people within the United States. Do we find that we have people who are going into this dark place and acquiring this information and using it, and they live right here in the United States? They're among us.
Yes, sir, that happens, and many times they're prosecuted.
And what I'm my next question is, do they purchase one identity or do they purchase 1,000? I'm trying to get some sense of how this information is actually used. Is it used by a single perpetrator with one identity, or does this perpetrator decide that I'll just sit here and I'll create 20 different identities and I'll find a way to make money doing it?
Sir, the cases I've seen typically involve either the bulk collection, the bulk sale, or bulk fraud associated with that data. You tend not to see single actors with a few identities.
Now, let's go back to, you spoke of rewards, almost as though this would be a bounty. Would you explain how you think that might work, the reward system?
Well, it could model something like the Qui Tam system, where you have individuals who notice that there are nefarious activities. For example, the whistleblower program, where they bring these activities to law enforcement and they get rewarded for that. And I think it could be a system that's very similar to that system, where there is rewards provided by government, federal, state, and local government for individuals who report cybercrime.
Now, what's the fallacy in this, if you think that there's a fallacy, someone else? What's the fallacy in providing a reward for a whistleblower, as it were, different type, who brings evidence to the government for prosecution purposes? What's the fallacy in that? All right, I take it that that is something that you would all agree is feasible and doable and something that we should consider.
I'll just say it's the first time I've heard of such a thing, so I don't really have an opinion at this point.
And you probably want to put bounds around, just like in the conventional world, bounty hunting in general. So I haven't really thought about this in such a way. But if you go back in our history with piracy, yes, we did have the letters of marque, and the U.S. government enabled and empowered entities to not only get a bounty, but keep the booty, literally, in terms of some of the activity there. They were sanctioned by the government.
If I may quickly, Mr. Chairman, but I think that this has been indicated to be a system of providing information, intelligence to the government, not acquiring assets, public or individual not acquiring assets, but providing information. Is that what you're talking about, sir?
That's right, but I think in the current construct, I think the switch from providing information on cyber attack to information on putting on the time machine hat on an attack on the open seas is, I see very little daylight actually between the two. I think they both cause incredible damage to our country.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I owe you 1 minute and 6 seconds.
The chair yields back. The ranking member yields back. The chairman now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, if you have more questions.
Just a theme I'd like to wrap up on. I was having dinner the other night, or trying to, and the power went out in this restaurant, and I'm drinking my beer, which is off the record. I didn't have a beer. I had a Coke. And they literally asked us to leave the restaurant because the power went out. I said, well, why don't you just take my order, cook the food, and I'll pay you cash? Oh, well, we can't do that. We have no way to account for it. We don't have any way to write it down. I mean, I just felt like, how pitiful is that? But when you get that societally, and thinking about it in a banking context, we are now so dependent to this interconnected web that I do view cyber crime as, for the next generation, the same as a nuclear threat, and that's not too dramatic, I think, even though we think about the mass loss of life, in a nuclear environment. But the ability to shut down the power grid in a capital market system, or the electrical grid, and the data communication system in a modern economy now could be just as horrific. So how do we broadcast a system of mutual assured destruction in cyber? How do we begin through treaty work, bilateral work, communication, instead of keeping it so sub rosa, that we actually say, hey, look, pal, you try to take down our commercial or national security interest, you're toast. What's the process there? How do we get there on that?
That's precisely, Congressman, the approach I think we do need to take, because we can't treat this as a quiet issue alone. It has to not only have sunlight, but for it to have any semblance of impact and consequence to change behavior, it needs to be publicly articulated. I think that's a deterrent strategy. I think we need to look at all the instrumentalities, military, political, economic, and others that can be brought to bear. Recognize that cyber-related issues are on par with traditional forms of diplomatic issues, and it really is going to come down to signaling and having the wherewithal to follow through on our words, which we haven't had great success in recent, and always following through on red lines that we've devised. But we do need to put lines in the silicon and demonstrate when they're crossed, expect a response. The one issue I would say that's a little different vis-a-vis nuclear is that the bar is so low to have a cyber capability, whereas you needed a huge infrastructure, both scientifically and economically, to have a nuclear capability. In this case,
should make
the club is so much bigger.
Make it more disturbing.
I hear you, and the club is so much bigger. But there are, again, as I started out, not all hacks are the same, not all hackers are the same, and there are certain things we can do to delineate those actors that are most brazen in their activity.
Other comments?
Sir, I violently agree. And I think sitting back and saying over and over again, ouch, that hurts, and basically signaling to our adversaries that they can continue to attack us with impunity is unacceptable for our nation. And I think we need to explore all options and come up with a campaign and a thoughtful approach about how to respond to these attacks.
Thank you, panel, and thank you for your service to our country, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I want to thank the gentlemen for their testimony today. I feel just a tad bit safer that I know that you three are on Team USA. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of your work, and thank you for your testimony. Without objection, all members will have 5 little set of days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. I'd ask the witnesses to respond as promptly as you possibly can. Without objection, this hearing is now adjourned.
Good job. Let me know tomorrow on the... Okay, how's you?